In this tutorial, we are going to paint two versions of the color wheel. One version is the traditional version with red, yellow, and blue, and the other is the more modern version with cyan, magenta, and yellow. So let's get started. To start, make sure you have two circles on a piece of paper. I used a small bowl to draw the circles as like a reference to make sure I had a perfect circle, but you can use whatever you have on hand or just draw some imperfect circles with your references. It doesn't really matter. We are making some pretty imperfect and wonderfully messy watercolor color wheels here. So after you've drawn the circles, the next step is to separate them into 12 slices because we are going to be making a 12 slice color wheel. The way that I like to do that is by first separating the color wheel into quarters. So you can see that I've done that by drawing a line halfway through the circle, both vertically and horizontally, or like as a cross, and then separate each quarter into thirds. And so I've done that across the middle of the line as well, just by drawing two lines in each quarter. But as you can also see, my slices are far from perfect. In the place where they intersect in the circle, the lines are definitely slightly off. Some of the slices are bigger than others, but that's okay. And as we will be able to tell throughout this tutorial, because we're using watercolor, all of the colors kind of blend together anyway, so we're not really going to see the lines underneath. I'm a big fan of imperfection. So before I start painting, I just want to test out the colors I'm going to be using. For the more traditional color wheel, I'm using alizarin crimson for red, and then Hansa yellow medium for yellow, and Prussian blue for blue. And then for the cyan yellow magenta color wheel, I'm using Quin magenta for magenta, and phthalo blue green shade for cyan, and then Hansa yellow medium for yellow. And so we're going to do both of these color wheels. And I'm going to start with the traditional color wheel. First, when I paint any kind of color wheel, I like to start with the primary colors. If you didn't know, primary colors are called primary colors because in color theory, they are the colors that you cannot create by mixing other colors together. Traditionally, in art and in color theory in general, the accepted primary colors have been red, yellow, and blue. And so that's the color wheel that we are going to start with. First, paint one slice, one primary color. I started with red. Then count 3 slices, and on the 4th slice, paint the next primary color. I put blue as my next one. And as you can see, for this slice, I painted half of it blue, and then I washed off my paintbrush and filled in the rest of the slice with water, allowing the paint to kind of grade down throughout the slice. That's to show color value. But as we go throughout this process, a lot of my slices kind of got messy, and so you couldn't see the color values very much, but I still liked the result. So after you've painted blue, do the same thing, count 3 slices, and on the 4th slice, paint yellow. So we have the primary colors, and between all of the primary colors are 3 empty slices. So let's go ahead and fill those in. First, start with the secondary colors. The secondary color that sits between yellow and red is orange. To mix a secondary color, you need to mix basically equal amounts of 2 primary colors. That's the idea anyway. But when it comes to using watercolor and pigments, it doesn't always equal exactly equal amounts in order to get the secondary color. Sometimes one pigment is stronger than a different one, so it does take a little bit of experimenting to get the right shade. But that's kind of the magical thing with mixing colors with watercolor anyway, is I think that if you mix your own colors, you're really not going to get the same color twice. They're all going to be slightly different, and I think that imperfection kind of makes it magical. So once you have the secondary color, which is supposed to be equal amounts of 2 primary colors, then you can paint the tertiary colors, which if the tertiary colors between red and yellow are red, orange, and yellow, orange. As you might be able to surmise, tertiary colors have differing amounts of the primary colors, where one primary color is like the primary mixer, basically, and that is the color you tack on top of the secondary color. I put these tertiary colors in the wrong places. I was supposed to put the lighter orange or yellow orange next to yellow and the red orange next to red, but I didn't, and I didn't realize it until after I'd already started filming, so there's a small mistake, but I wanted to note that. You can also see that the colors are kind of blending together because of the wet on wet technique. I didn't wait for these slices to dry, which I did on purpose. I kind of like that effect anyway. So now I've moved on to a different portion of the color wheel where I mixed red and blue to make violet. And then I mixed yellow and blue to make green. One thing I will note about blue, basically both of the blues I'm using, Prussian blue and phthalo blue, are very strongly pigmented. So you don't need as much blue as you need the other primary color to make these secondary colors. I feel like that's an important thing to note. So then after I've filled in the secondary colors, the rest of the secondary colors on the color wheel, violet and green, now it's time to make the tertiary colors. So to make the color between red and violet, I need to add a little bit more red to the violet mixture that I have on my palette to make red violet. And then to make blue violet, which is the slice between violet and blue, then I add a little bit more blue to that same mixture to get a slightly more blue violet. And we'll do the same thing with green and yellow. So I'm painting yellow green right there, between yellow and green, and then between green and blue, I will add some more blue. As you can see, as I was trying to mix this, adding just a little bit more blue mostly just made the green slightly darker. So I added more blue to the green mixture than I would to the other color mixes because I was trying to make a blue-green that was a little bit more of a blue-green. But I was pretty happy with the result we got here. I would call this kind of darker blue-green equivalent to a Prussian green, maybe, if you've ever seen that color before. A kind of dark but slightly vibrant green. So that is the traditional color wheel. And now let's make it the same color wheel, use the same method, but we're going to use the more modern primary colors, which are cyan, magenta, and yellow. So yellow's the same. I'm using the same yellow, but I'm using magenta and phthalo blue for magenta and cyan. So I started with the magenta slice, and then I went 4 slices over and painted the cyan slice, and then did the same thing with yellow. I will say that this is a really interesting practice. You might not know, if you don't know anything about the difference between the traditional color wheel and this more modern color wheel, that's okay. I'm not going to go super in-depth into the reasoning behind having these 2 color wheels. We're mostly just doing this video to look at the differences so that you can see really what the differences are. But as I'm painting the orange slice between magenta and yellow, notice that that orange slice looks pretty red. That is one of the reasons why a lot of theorists and some scientists think that the real primary colors, in air quotes, the real primary colors are magenta, cyan, and yellow, because you can actually make a color that is pretty close to red using magenta and yellow. And I think that it's more of a red-orange, but it's, that's a little bit of semantics and has to do with human error and color mixing as well. What this video I hoped for is just to show you that both versions can be useful. So I went ahead and mixed the secondary colors as well, and right off the bat you can see that the orange and green look pretty similar, a little bit more vibrant, but the violet between cyan and magenta is basically a different color from the violet between alizarin crimson and Prussian blue. It's a lot more vibrant and maybe a lot more like the purple that you are used to envisioning when you think of violet. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that after we have finished with the color wheel. So now that I have painted all of the secondary colors, I'm just going in with the tertiary colors. And as I've mentioned before, when I mix colors, especially with watercolors, because a lot of these pigments are, natural pigments and have different qualities in them, it definitely takes a little bit of eyeballing it and guesswork to create the colors that are like exactly in between. So feel free to experiment with that, and don't worry if you don't get a quote perfect color wheel, because when you're creating them yourself, no such thing exists. And that's what's so beautiful about it. So I mixed in some red to the violet mixture to get some red violet, and then I mixed in a little bit more blue than I was intending for the blue violet portion, but that also brings me to the other example of why a lot of people consider the CMY color wheel the real color wheel, is because you can create like a dark blue by mixing magenta and cyan, as is demonstrated with that blue violet where I put just a little bit too much cyan in there, I think, I didn't quite get the blue violet that I was hoping for. So then I moved on to yellow-green, between green and yellow, and I was having the same kind of issue with the blue-green. I was hoping for a little bit more of a turquoise, but I think that mostly the blue-green is going to be more like Prussian green than a turquoise between cyan and green. And that trick that I told you about before, where I painted half the slice and then filled in the rest with water, is my good trick to get kind of that washy watercolor effect. And there you go. We have two versions of the color wheel. So the traditional version of the color wheel, I think, has like more moody, earthy tones, and the CMY color wheel is definitely more vibrant. I think I take issue with saying that one is better than the other, mostly because I think, especially as a landscape artist, that there is a lot of good that can come from the traditional color wheel. And especially if you're trying to create like a more realistic style painting for landscapes, those kind of more diluted, a lot of people call that violet. Violet is often the color that people reference the most as the biggest difference, because there is quite a difference between the darker violet in the traditional color wheel and the much more vibrant violet. A lot of people call that violet more of like a muddy brown, which I don't disagree with, but I also think that that kind of darker, earthy violet definitely has a place in art, especially when you're trying to capture more realistic things. But so does the CMY color wheel, where you can get these really bright, vibrant colors. I would especially use the CMY color wheel for things like florals, or if I was just looking to explore color a little more. So mostly from this video, I wanted you to have my takes, see them side by side, and understand that the more you work with color, the different results you're going to get. And color theory is not a finite one is better than the other. I think that as artists, it's important to experiment and to figure out for yourself what you like best. But the more education and knowledge you have, the better you're going to explore your preferences and explore the world of color around you. So there you go. This is the end of my side-by-side tutorial where we made two different color wheels. I hope you liked it. I will probably do more videos on color theory in the future. This wasn't supposed to be like an in-depth comparison, just an FYI, I guess. So if you liked this video, please feel free to subscribe. I often do tutorials, and if you have any suggestions for what I should do in the future, I'd love to hear that as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.